Today, my guest is author Professor Lori D. Ginzberg. We will be talking about her new book from Hill and Wang, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, An American Life. Lori is a professor of history and women's studies at Pennsylvania State University. She has written several books on women's history, including most recently Untidy Origins, a story of women's rights in antebellum New York. She resides in Philadelphia. Lori, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline.
I'm so glad you're with us to talk about this very important and famous woman. And we talk about, first of all, the thing I'd like to talk about, your new book, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is a biography of the life of a 19th century woman who worked for women's rights and the vote for women. But many people do not know her name in that capacity. They know the connection with Susan B. Anthony, but often when I talk to people about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they say, who is she? Let's begin by telling the 19th century time frame in which she lived and worked, first of all.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, I have to say, I laughed at what you just said because the most surprising thing to me about writing this biography is how many people had never heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And I've actually given that question a lot of thought.
That's shocking, isn't it?
Well, it's shocking in the sense that, you know, our historical icons, I think especially when they are women, are often forgotten. But I actually think that part of the reason that she's as forgotten as she is because the ideas that she endorsed are so much part of the water of the times we live in, that you can find very few people nowadays to object to women's right to own property if they're married, or women's right to vote, or girls' right to get an education. And I think the radical ideas that she promoted so passionately and against such forceful opposition in her own time are pretty much commonplace in our times. And I think that's part of why she's been lost to history. I know when I talk about her to my students, they just don't see what's radical about what she supported.
Well, I think that's true. I think a lot of people do have trouble seeing things within the historical perspective.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think a lot of history is omitted or rewritten even to suit current times. And so we can't really blame the students and the people for that because, first of all, a lot of historical things aren't even taught. Well, the next thing that I wanted to say, I am related to Cady Stanton and had the pleasure of visiting most of the sites where she lived and searched out her papers in several collections, and I know the difficulties you must have encountered in doing your research. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, actually, doing research on Elizabeth Cady Stanton used to be very difficult because her papers are scattered in many places. They're mostly at Rutgers University in New Jersey and at Vassar College. But a number of years ago, Patricia Holland and Ann Gordon put together 45 reels of microfilm of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's papers, and they have made the job of the historian who's interested in these women and in the movement that they help lead immeasurably easier. So I did run around to archives to look at things that, of people who knew Stanton and visited her home and so forth, but really Ann Gordon and Patricia Holland's work was a blessing. And Ann Gordon runs the Stanton and Anthony Paper Project at Rutgers and is putting together 6 fabulously edited volumes of their papers, which people should
Well, that's very true. And an interesting point is that those microfilms came out during my research time, and they came out after I had run around to all of these places doing the research.
Right.
And the first thing I did was to purchase the collection of microfilm and donated it to my local library so that future historians had the opportunity to make things easier in learning about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So that thing they did, it's good to hear you say that about them.
It's really wonderful work. And, in the past, I'm a historian who usually studies the connections between the material lives and the intellectual histories of far more ordinary women about whom there are way fewer sources. So in that sense, doing a biography of a woman who lived and did not stop talking or writing for 87 years was a whole different kind of work for me, and it was thrilling. It actually was, more fun than I would ordinarily admit work is. I mean, it was really a romp.
Yes. Of course, her handwriting was very difficult to read, so I'm sure you had trouble with that.
Right.
And then the family destroyed a lot of her papers.
Son she had 7 children, but one of her sons, Theodore Stanton, and one of her daughters, Harriet Stanton Blatch, who became a leading women's suffrage leader in her own right in the 20th century, they were very careful to protect and shape their mother's historical reputation, and they destroyed who knows what after she died.
Yes, that would have been wonderful for you to have found some of that.
Right.
Now, we will get into some specific issues later, hopefully, but what I would like to do now is talk to our listeners about the way you put the book together. Now, the book is divided into 6 chapters, and since Cady Stanton's life was crammed full and often controversial, I'd like to base our overview discussion on that outline because she did accomplish so much, and I'd like our listeners to hear what she accomplished. So the first chapter is titled The Two Worlds of Elizabeth Cady, and it covers the period from 1815 to 1840. Tell us a little bit about what was going on during this period, where she grew up, and what life was like for women at that time.
Sure. Elizabeth Cady was born in 1815 in Johnstown, New York, to quite privileged parents. Her father was in Congress at the time that she was born and would later become a judge, Judge Daniel Cady. Her mother was Margaret Livingston Cady, the daughter of a Revolutionary War hero. And the family was quite well off and well connected. They owned at least one slave and continued to do so until the 1820s when slavery was finally ended in the state of New York. And she grew up in what sounds like a very strict household. She described the everlasting no, no, no that she heard as a child, that usually God or parents or someone wanted children to be more cramped than she felt was her nature. But she described mostly a childhood with a father she adored who was very rigid and old-fashioned in terms of gender. And the story that she told about herself was that her 20-year-old brother, Eleazar, died when Elizabeth Cady was 11. And seeking to comfort her father, she sat on his lap and tried to comfort him, and he said, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you'd been a boy." And it's the sting of that remark that she took as a kind of challenge, at least as she remembered it later in her life, to shape her life. And so what I describe in that chapter is a very privileged, comfortable world in all material senses, but one in which she felt at a very young age the restrictions on her sex. She wasn't allowed to go to college with the boys and was very resentful at being left behind, and so on. The other world in the two worlds is that after she finished her education at the Troy Female Seminary, which was, incidentally, about as good an education as girls could get at the time. It was quite an excellent education in the school founded by Emma Willard. When she finished her education, she spent a certain amount of time at her cousin Gerrit Smith's house in Peterborough, New York. And Gerrit Smith was, by then, a radical abolitionist. And so she moved back and forth between her family's conservative, federalist, stodgy, slave-owning upstate New York home to her cousin Gerrit Smith's home, where she met abolitionists and met people of all types. And he was very generous as a host and had all kinds of people, escaped slaves and leading activists in his home. And it was also there that she met a young man, although 10 years her senior, named Henry Brewster Stanton, who was a fiery abolitionist speaker who thrilled her with his words, and they fell in love, and in 1840 married and spent their honeymoon at a very famous World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London. So the two worlds really were the world of the kind of stodgy Federalist New York judge's family and the very lively, fascinating, thrilling intellectual world of 1830s anti-slavery.
Yes, and she was disappointed when she went to London, was she not, with what went on there? That the women
Right.
had to sit in the back in the
Right.
back
Well,
of the bus,
right.
so to speak.
Right. What happened in London was that because of various disputes, complicated disputes within American anti-slavery, and also between the British and American abolitionists, women were not admitted as delegates to the convention. Stanton herself didn't go as a delegate. She went as Henry's new bride.
Yes.
But there were other women delegates, 8 of them, very active, long-time abolitionists and pro-women's rights supporters who were barred from the meeting, and they sat behind a railing and had to observe the convention, and were joined by 3 men, William Lloyd Garrison, famously, and 2 others, in protest against their exclusion. Henry Stanton was not on that side of the debate and did not openly protest the women's exclusion, as far as I can tell.
You know, even knowing a lot about that history, as you tell that story, I sit here feeling shocked. Like you say, a lot of your students don't understand, and yet here I'm more aware of it, and I still say, oh my goodness, how could that have happened? So there is that little disbelief thing that goes on.
Right.
Let's talk about the next section. Chapter 2 is from 1840 to 1851 and is called, quote, this is a quote from her, long accumulating discontent. Synopsize this period for my audience, please,
Okay.
Lori.
The Stantons came back to the United States, of course, from London. Spent a few years floundering. I mean, Henry's passion was in anti-slavery lecturing, but he couldn't support a wife who had grown up more comfortably than he was accustomed, and soon to be a number of children on his income. So he went to law school, and they floundered a bit. They lived in Boston for a little while, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton described Boston as a moral museum, just loved soaking up the intellectual life and meeting famous abolitionists. And I have to say, she comes across as something of a dilettante in these years. She hasn't found her passion and her purpose, except that she knows she loves intellectual exchange, and she knows she loves being in the action. And she and Henry are starting to figure out where to settle. In 1846-7, they moved to Seneca Falls, New York, where I assume you've been in your travels of Stanton haunts. And it actually probably was a much less sleepy town than it appears today, because there was industry and bustle and so forth. But they moved to Seneca Falls. They, by the late 1840s, have 3 small sons. And Stanton plunges into the excitement of having her own home and being a, overdoing it housewife, supermom, we might say, in current parlance. But she fairly quickly realizes that this is not going to satisfy her. She really does come across through the documents as someone with a passion for being in the center of the action, for learning, for action, for ideas. And frustrated, what happens in 1848, and this is a very famous moment even in high school textbooks, which often have a little boxed excerpt about it. In 1848, she's invited to the home of Jane Hunt, and a bunch of women are there, 4 or 5, 6 women, visiting with Lucretia Mott, whom Stanton had met in London, all Quaker women, all related to one another, one way or another, and they invite the young, fiery Stanton along to join them, and she pours out, that's where that quote comes from, her long accumulating discontent. She's getting bored. She's got, her theories of child raising and her energy in housework only occupied so much of her mind. And so she describes her hungering for action, and she gets everyone heated up, as she put it, and they decided to call a convention to demand the full rights for women, and that's the famous Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. All these women were abolitionists. All of them were politically active. All of them had heard of women's rights before. I think what Stanton's role in this was to say this passion was enough for her to start to articulate a grander vision of women's status. And so they called this convention, organized it 2 weeks later, and 300 people came. And it was quite an astonishing event.
Well, it certainly was, and I haven't been back to Seneca Falls to see the how things have changed there. That was all coming together when I visited. They did have the wonderful statues there, but I imagine it's quite different these days. But let's go to the next section of your book. Let's see, where are we? We're into the boiling point, is that correct? We're now into 1851 to 1861, and it begins with her meeting Susan B. Anthony, who more people are familiar with.
Right.
Talk about that period.
Okay. I think that the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 opened up a new life for Elizabeth Cady Stanton. As I said, it had been all these reformers who'd been there, and perhaps not everything there was new to them, but clearly for Stanton, it was the start of a new life. But that life would not have been really possible if she had not met Susan B. Anthony in the spring of 1851, who became her lifelong friend and partner and co-worker and muse and person to argue with and helpmate when Stanton had 7 children and needed to write and couldn't get any writing done, and Susan B. Anthony would show up and take over. So I think that what's dramatic in 1851 is this meeting, which surely no one at the time knew signaled the beginning of a lifelong pair. And throughout the 1850s, Stanton and Anthony collaborated in developing what really begins to look like a full-blown philosophy of women's rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was never only interested in the right to vote, and it's in the 1850s that we see her beginning to talk about not only the right to vote and property rights, but women's right to wear clothing that didn't drag them down. So she and Anthony and a number of other leading women's rights figures started to wear this bloomer costume, which was these kind of baggy pants that tapered at the ankle and had a long jacket and were hooted in the streets. And for Stanton, this wasn't only about being more comfortable. It was another way to make a philosophy of women's rights that talked about women's degradation and inability to move comfortably through the world. They developed Stanton especially began to develop ideas about divorce. You see that starting in the 1850s, where she began to talk about marriage as a contract that treated its parties, men and women, unequally, and that women should be able to break with enough reason. It's also in the 1850s she finishes having the last ones of her 7 children. An experience that she described to a friend as her biennial clumsiness, but she claimed to have no regrets about having so many, but certainly it was a period when she was, to some degree trapped by her own, her own household responsibilities. She described herself in that period as a caged lioness, to which Susan B. Anthony would reply somewhat tartly, "Stop having so many babies."
Yes, and is it not correct in this chapter, you talk about the fact that her husband Henry was not around much of this time?
He was not around really much at all. It was still a time when Henry had enormous political ambitions and got very involved in the anti-slavery part of the Democratic Party, a whole other complicated story. Was in the state Senate in New York for a while. And they really do seem to have been on parallel tracks through the 1850s. You see by the 1850s which of the Stantons is becoming the bigger star. And that, I think, caused some discomfort for Henry, who I think didn't really know what hit him. I mean, had no idea that this bright, lively young woman was going to become the leading feminist philosopher of the 19th century. And he's not around a lot. He never made it home for any of his children's births. I say in the book, it's hard to conjure up much of an image of what Henry did at home except make babies.
Yes.
And they certainly did that a lot. But I think in many ways it was a decade that Stan herself described as enormously frustrating. She at one point says, "Men and angels give me patience. I'm at the boiling point." She was dying to be able to get on the road, to write, to think, to do her research. And Anthony was certainly eager for her to join her and do that. At the same time, it was a very exciting time because they were fleshing out all their ideas. It must have felt like, just an enormously intellectually thrilling time.
Well,
for
and
them
then what happens next, just when they feel they're starting to get this all together, war breaks out. And that is the next part of
Right.
your book. The Civil War period is discussed in Chapter 4, War and Reconstruction, and covers the period from 1861 to 1868. And this was a difficult period personally for Cady Stanton. Talk a little bit about that period and why there was so much difficulty.
Well, I think that unlike most abolitionists who were very worried about war, many of them were Quakers, many of Stanton's friends were Quakers, pacifists, and both Stantons, Henry and Elizabeth, seem to have welcomed war. Elizabeth Cady Stanton believed from the start that war would open up doors to all kinds of emancipations, both of slaves and of women, and they welcomed it. They don't seem to have been nervous about the kind of martial drumbeat that ran through their children's play or their sons wanting to go to war or any of those things. During the war, the Stantons moved to New York City, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton was well positioned, along with her friend Susan B. Anthony, to set up the Women's Loyal National League and organize women to sign petitions calling on the war to be an anti-slavery war, which is what abolitionists did. They were actually fairly effective in getting those petitions signed, although I suspect that, as in many cases, Stanton did much of the writing and Anthony did much of the work of actually getting the petition drives organized and so on. When the war ended, Stanton entered one of the most troubling parts of her career, a debate that has caused historians to argue and wring their hands ever since, and I guess I'm entering that conversation in writing this book,
Yes.
which was that when the war ended, there was the 13th Amendment emancipating the slaves. There was the 14th Amendment, which for the first time put the word male in the U.S. Constitution. And then there was a debate over a 15th Amendment granting black men, but not explicitly women, the right to vote. And there were friends of Stanton's, people she considered her allies, Frederick Douglass, Lucy Stone, who said this is the Negro's hour, to use the phrase of the day, and that women should wait until after black men had the vote. And it caused a great deal of pain and bitterness and hardship. I think that Stanton was an absolutist. She saw everything through the lens of women's rights, and she feared that having an amendment that granted black men the vote was creating what she called an aristocracy of sex, and that she was mortified, she was humiliated, she was furious, and she was bitter. Unfortunately, what she did with those feelings was make some quite ugly and explicit racist attacks on the possibility of black men, but not white women, having the vote, alienating her friends and not recognizing that they too had made a moral choice in deciding, right or wrong, but in deciding that given the racial violence that was happening throughout the South in the wake of the war, that black communities needed whatever tools they could have to protect their newly gained rights. And I think that she never, well, maybe like many absolutists, never was willing to grant the moral complexity of that position. And it was a difficult time when her elitism and racism and her more tepid commitment to anti-slavery, I think, came through.
Well, that is an interesting point, and as you say, it will go on probably ad infinitum, but I tried to put myself in that position, and I wondered whether the horrible things that she said, which cannot be excused, but as you pointed out, was so filled with bitterness and anger and seeing all of their work going down the wayside. It's kind of, and I don't know whether it's a fair comparison, but it's kind of like the women that were supporting Hillary Clinton, and then she did not get the nomination for the office. There was a lot of things said, certainly had nothing to do, no comments made about race, but I think there were a lot of things said in anger and disappointment, and maybe that's what happened to her, but she made the big mistake then of going on to keep at it and keep writing about it and keep talking about it. So it's hard to say whether her bitterness then did develop even more deeply, because we'll never really know the true reasons for it. But yes, that's
Right.
how she's going to be known for that period.
Right. Although in a later period, I guess this is maybe jumping ahead to the next chapter, I don't know, but in a later period, that same sense of elitism and that sense of entitlement as an American-born, well-educated, virtuous, middle-class white woman comes through in her defense of educated suffrage.
Yes, you're talking about your next chapter, Revolution in the Road, during 1868 to 1880.
Yeah, or maybe the next one after that. But yeah,
okay,
it's sort of a continuous thread.
Yeah, yes, it is.
Through her life, where she said, is it okay to jump to that? Where she says, it would be a very bitter drop in our cup if foreigners get any political status above, native-born, virtuous white women. And I think that Stanton, and I attribute this in part to how she grew up and where she grew up, I think she felt incredibly American. I think she felt betrayed by the promises of the Declaration of Independence. The pursuit of happiness had been denied women. She described herself as a daughter of the American Revolution. And I think that part of that Americanness was, unfortunately, and we've seen this, happen again, denying the Americanness of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And saying, how could you deny this to me, of all people? That kind of, elitism.
Well, yes, and there were people still around during her girlhood and later that had fought in the American Revolution. And again, taking it within the context of history is very hard for us to make that leap. But oftentimes that's what we must do, is to make that leap and try to understand it no matter how awful. And talk a little bit more then about what started happening then, because I guess we are now into her place in history in 1880 to 1902, when there were a lot of relationships being developed, and Elizabeth Cady, I think, went on to feel a little bitter and disappointment in the lack of recognition of her as a leader. So talk more about that. That's very important.
Well, the way I would describe her last 20 years, really what it is, that other people would have slowed down. She's 65. She has just spent 12 years on the road lecturing all over the West. And other people might slow down, but not her. And it's in the final years of her life that she and Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, another upstate New York active women's rights leader, edit the first 3 volumes of the History of Women's Suffrage, which is an incredible compendium of stories and data and pictures and pamphlets and laws and so forth.
Can I interrupt you here, Lori? When was it prior to this that she wrote the Woman's History of the Bible, or the Woman's Bible? Was that later?
In the 1890s, she publishes the Woman's Bible, which is a kind of feminist criticism. We would call it a feminist criticism of the Bible, but I think actually its impact was greater within the women's movement than in the field of biblical criticism, because she was chastised, censured, basically, within her own organization that she'd helped found for such liberal, it was seen as anti-Christian views. And it's also in the 1890s that she writes her own memoir, 80 Years and More, which is how she tells the story of her perky, brilliant 11-year-old self, and so on. So through the 1880s and 90s, she never stops. She is, writing. She hated going to conventions, but she would speak and she would write. She wrote articles very late in her life. She died in 1902, but very late in her life, she writes a friend, "My next job is to clean up the continent."
Oh, my.
And you read this and you laugh. She was a force to be reckoned with. And, I understand Susan B. Anthony writing after Stanton died, and she received the telegram in 1902 that she had died. She said, "It's a great hush." And I can see that, because she had articles coming out in newspapers for weeks after she died.
And she was referred to as one of the greatest women of her time.
Right.
Right. Can you wrap up and give us your conclusions now? I think we've got enough time for us to hear what's your final analysis and conclusions about her.
I think there was no one quite like her. I think that she took the ideas that Americans consider ordinary and liberal, like equality under the law and, equal access to political rights, and inserted women into them. Part of why they seem so obvious to us is because they're so patriotic. They're so rational. And the opposition that she faced because of doing that made her realize how strongly Americans still held to their notion of women as a separate kind of being, not fully adult, not fully rational, and she fought that too. She took these liberal notions and she turned them into a much bigger, more radical analysis of women standing every place. She alienated people because she was also quite secular and anti-clerical, and as the Women's Bible controversy showed, feared women being controlled by religious institutions.
And sadly, she never saw the women's vote come.
And she never did.
And that's probably why Susan B. Anthony is so connected with it. Lori, this has been wonderful. I appreciate your being here. I love hearing your thoughts about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's a very important book, and of course my listeners can find a copy of this book at the local bookstore. And do come back again when you've got another book in the works. We'd love to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jacqueline. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.